Picture this. It's early March 2026. You're in the Iranian city of Qom, and a constitutional succession is underway.
Right.
But, this is far from your standard political transition. The 88 civilian jurists who make up Iran's assembly of experts, the men tasked with choosing the next supreme leader, they aren't just politicking or, trading favors or debating theology.
Yeah, well developed.
They are deliberating under active lethal bombardment.
I mean, the airspace above them is entirely contested. The city itself is a target. And the very building where this assembly is historically supposed to meet, the physical seat of their constitutional duty, has just been struck by a missile.
It's wild because usually when we think about constitutional processes, right, like an election, a royal succession, or, a parliamentary vote, we just unconsciously assume a baseline of physical safety.
Right, exactly. You assume the roof isn't going to cave in on you.
Exactly. I mean, you might have immense political pressure. You might have corruption, bribery, backroom deals. But you don't usually have an adversarial air force explicitly threatening the people trying to count the ballots.
No, you definitely don't.
And when that safety is violently removed, we just assume international law has this giant red alarm that goes off. But as it turns out, the entire architecture of international warfare and humanitarian law has a massive gaping blind spot.
It really does, and it's a blind spot that was utterly unrecognized until it was just violently exposed in 2026.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. So welcome to this deep dive. If you're listening, you are the kind of person who wants to bypass the talking heads, the endless cable news shouting matches, and get straight to the foundational aha moments.
Yeah, the real mechanics of what's happening.
Right. You want to understand not just the surface level events, but the underlying mechanisms of why things happen and how the world actually works. So today, we are exploring this really dense, highly analytical, and frankly groundbreaking research paper from the strategic think tank Cleston House.
It's a fascinating read.
The paper is titled The Reallocated Franchise.
And it's a text that really forces us to rethink everything we know about how state power transitions during wartime.
But before we take a single step further, we need to set a very strict boundary for this discussion.
Yes, very important.
We are looking purely at the structural, the legal, and the theoretical architecture that the Cleston House paper analyzes. We are absolutely not taking sides in the 2026 war itself.
Right, this isn't about picking a side.
Not at all. We're not here to debate the political justifications, the intelligence that led up to it, or the just ad bellum, meaning the international legal right to go to war in the first place.
Exactly. Whether you believe the campaign was, entirely justified or completely illegal is entirely outside the scope of our analysis today.
Totally outside. Our job is strictly to unpack the factual record as documented by Cleston House. We just want to explore the legal philosophy they present.
Because the mechanism they identify, it operates independently of the war's overarching legality.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how this legal gap operates, we first have to walk through a highly compressed, unprecedented timeline of events. So let's go back to February 28, 2026.
Right, the opening of hostilities.
Right. The United States and Israel launched massive joint military operations against Iran. The U.S. operation is designated Epic Fury, and the Israeli operation is Roaring Lion. And these opening strikes, they aren't just aimed at infrastructure.
No, not at all. They are aimed at the absolute pinnacle of the state. The campaign opens with a decapitation strike of just unprecedented scale.
And this is based on the attacking military's own accounts, right?
Yes, according to the Israel Defense Force's own published accounts, which, by the way, Cleston House relies on heavily to build an auditable factual record. The supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, is killed, and it is not an isolated assassination.
No, it was massive.
Roughly 40 senior officials are killed alongside him.
The Cleston House paper details that members of Khamenei's family were also killed in the strike on his compound. And, we need to establish the international nature of this conflict immediately because it triggers specific bodies of law.
Right.
3 U.S. service members are killed in the conflict's first few days.
Which is crucial, legally speaking. It confirms active American combat participation. So legally, this is undeniably an international armed conflict.
Meaning all the heavy-duty laws apply.
Exactly. It means the Geneva Conventions and customary international humanitarian law are fully in effect. No ambiguities there.
So the head of state is dead. The commander-in-chief is gone. In a lot of autocracies, this is the exact moment where the state apparatus just fractures.
You'd expect chaos? A civil war, maybe a military coup, generals turning on each other in the streets.
Right, a total vacuum.
Yeah.
But Iran has a highly institutionalized constitution. They have machinery built specifically for the sudden absence of a leader.
They do. Article 111 of the Iranian Constitution is this designated crisis machinery. It is a highly specific protocol that outlines exactly what happens when the supreme leader is incapacitated, dismissed, or dies.
So it's essentially a pre-programmed continuity plan.
Yes. It dictates that an interim council must assume the duties of the office immediately, preventing any legal vacuum.
And the paper notes this machinery actually functioned exactly on schedule, which is honestly fascinating given the level of destruction. I mean, by March 1st, an interim council is in place.
Right, despite the bombardment.
It consists of the president, the head of the judiciary, and one jurist from the Guardian Council. They're holding the reins of the state.
But their role is strictly custodial. I mean, they don't inherit the permanent power of the supreme leader.
Right, they just keep the lights on.
Exactly. The actual power to choose the successor is vested in the Assembly of Experts, which is a body of 88 civilian Islamic jurists.
And their traditional seat, the headquarters where they convene for this specific constitutional duty, is the city of Qom. Which brings us to March 3rd, just 3 days into the conflict.
Things escalate quickly here.
They really do. The Israeli Air Force strikes the building housing the Assembly of Experts in Qom. Now, the paper is careful to highlight the fog of war here. There are conflicting reports about the exact circumstances of the strike.
Yeah, Cluson House maintains rigorous evidentiary discipline on this point. They note that Israeli sources claim the strike happened while a vote was actively taking place.
But vote counters were killed, right?
Yes, and that the physical ballot box was literally destroyed. Conversely, Iranian state-linked media claimed the building had been evacuated and was completely empty at the time of the strike.
But the authors argue we don't actually need to resolve that factual dispute.
No, we don't. Because regardless of who was physically in the room, there is a shared load-bearing fact that both belligerents agree on. The building was targeted and struck.
And more crucially, an Israeli defense official explicitly stated to the press that the aim of the strike was, quote, to prevent them from choosing a new supreme leader.
That quote is everything. The target wasn't a weapons cache. It wasn't a military commander hiding in the basement.
The target was the process of choosing itself.
Exactly. And this is where we run into a massive void in academic literature and strategic theory.
Explain that. What do you mean by a void?
Well, if you read political science studies on leadership decapitation scholars like Jenna Jordan or Brian Price, they've spent their entire careers analyzing what happens when you assassinate the leader of a state or a non-state actor.
Right. They look at what happens next.
Yeah, they measure whether the organization collapses, fractures, or becomes more extreme. But that entire body of research shares a massive unstated assumption.
Good assumption.
They assume the target is always the incumbent, the person currently sitting in the chair. They treat the organization's procedure for replacing that leader as a neutral, invulnerable mechanism just operating in the background. Right. They have no theoretical framework for what happens when the machinery of replacement is the actual thing being bombed.
So I want to make sure I'm wrapping my head around the distinction here. Usually, leadership decapitation is like a hostile corporate takeover where you manage to fire the CEO. Causes chaos, the stock plummets, everyone panics.
Sure, that's the standard model.
But what happened on March 3rd in Qom, it was like setting fire to the HR department's conference room while they were actively interviewing the replacement candidates, specifically to stop them from hiring anyone.
That is a brilliant way to look at it. That captures the structural shift perfectly. The violence wasn't directed at the executive who wields power. It was directed at the constitutional mechanism that generates power.
But practically speaking, how does a state actually conduct an election while dodging airstrikes? I mean, you have 88 mostly elderly clerics, a bombed-out headquarters.
And their communications networks are likely compromised or completely destroyed.
Exactly. How does the Constitution reconcile with the physical reality of a war zone?
Well, it doesn't reconcile. It warps. And this brings us to the core conceptual breakthrough of the Cluson House paper. They introduce a term that anchors their entire analysis.
The title of the paper.
Yes, the reallocated franchise. To understand this concept, we have to look at a basic truth about constitutional law that peacetime theorists often just ignore. You cannot simply veto a constitutional selection with armed force.
Wait, I mean, if you bomb the building where they vote, aren't you vetoing the vote?
You are delaying it or disrupting it for sure, but constitutions do not have a null option built into their succession protocols.
A null option.
Right, like an option to just say nobody wins. Succession provisions are designed as crisis machinery. Their defining feature is that they do not allow for abstention or permanent pause.
So the system demands an output.
Yes. When the incumbent dies, a clock starts. And that clock runs until it produces a name. An attacker can make the process incredibly dangerous and costly, but they cannot force the Constitution to output the result of nobody.
Okay, that makes sense. Iran's Article 111 proves that point, really. I mean, it engaged within 72 hours of the opening strikes, despite massive bombardment. The legal process didn't stop.
But the material conditions under which that process had to operate were radically altered. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the paper breaks down the physical preconditions required for a deliberative choice.
Because we often think of voting as just marking a piece of paper, right?
Exactly. But a constitutional assembly requires so much more. If you have 88 people who need to argue, form coalitions, and pick a leader, they require 3 physical realities. First, they need assembly. Co-presence.
Because deliberation requires reading the room, observing physical cues, engaging in real debate.
Yes. Second, they need time. Time for factions to form, for candidates to be tested, for alliances to break apart and reform.
Because a winning coalition isn't instantaneous, right? It's built through rounds of negotiation.
Exactly. And third, they need coalition security. They need the ability to canvass, to try and persuade their colleagues, and to count heads without the very act of communicating, making them a target for a precision airstrike.
These aren't just legal formalities. They are physical vulnerabilities. An armed force can just strip them away.
And this is the crucial pivot of the paper's argument force does not strip these conditions away equally from all 88 members. The exposure of the electorate is asymmetrical.
Okay, asymmetrical exposure. Let's break down what that actually looks like for these specific jurists in Iran.
So consider the demographics of the Assembly of Experts. On one hand, you have traditional civilian jurists. Many of them are elderly. They have fixed, publicly known residential addresses in Qom or Tehran.
There's public figures.
Right. They have public identities, and they completely lack any personal security apparatus or military infrastructure. They are completely addressable by an attacker.
Meaning, if one of those civilian clerics picks up a standard cell phone to call a colleague or gets in a civilian car to drive to a secret meeting, they are entirely exposed.
Yes. The physical cost of their participation in the vote becomes potentially lethal.
Wow.
Now, contrast them with other members of that same 88-person assembly who are deeply embedded in Iran's security infrastructure, specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
Okay, so the military-linked members.
Exactly. These members are likely dispersed. They have access to hardened underground bunkers. They are moving information through secure, encrypted military communication channels that were built specifically to function while under bombardment.
So when the meeting room in Qom is destroyed, the traditional civilian cleric is functionally paralyzed. He cannot safely communicate or travel.
But the IRGC-linked cleric is still operating, still communicating, still politicking.
That's wild, because no formal rule of the Iranian constitution was changed, right? Nobody was legally struck from the voter rolls.
Not a single one.
But the franchise, like the actual practical ability to exercise a vote and participate in the deliberation, was reallocated by physical exposure.
Exactly.
It makes me think of trying to hold a neighborhood council vote to elect the president of a homeowners association. The vote is scheduled for a Tuesday evening. But on Tuesday morning, a massive apocalyptic blizzard hits the town. 5 feet of snow.
Right, a total whiteout.
The bylaws of the HOA didn't change. The rules of the election are exactly the same. But suddenly, the only people who can physically make it to the community center to cast a ballot are the few residents who happen to own heavy-duty snowplows.
That's a great analogy.
The franchise wasn't destroyed, it was just reallocated to the snowplow owners.
And because of that reallocation, the outcome of the vote is virtually guaranteed to reflect the interests of the snowplow owners. A selection conducted under fire will inevitably converge on the candidate favored by the faction that is best equipped to survive the bombardment.
Because they literally become the bottleneck for the entire process. The paper points out that if you can't meet in the open, the election has to be administered secretly and remotely. Members have to be located, secured, moved, and connected through protected channels.
And whoever controls those secure channels doesn't just get to cast their own individual vote. They become the medium through which every other surviving vote must be exercised.
They control the infrastructure of the vote itself.
Yes. They control the flow of information, the timing of the ballots, and the physical security of the electors.
Which leads us directly to the historical outcome on March 9th, 2026. After days of remote convening, reported chaos, and alleged disputes, a result is finally announced. The new supreme leader is Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated leader.
And what does the Cleston House analysis note about his background?
It emphasizes that his close association with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is a widely reported, fundamental aspect of his power base.
Right.
The constitutional process, operating under immense coercion, produced a successor intimately tied to the exact military and security establishment that possessed the snowplows.
The paper also highlights a really fascinating detail about Iran's pre-war posture here. It notes that Iran had actually decentralized its chain of command prior to the U.S.-Israeli campaign.
Wait, really?
Yes. Regional commanders were reportedly granted pre-authorized operational authority in the event that the senior civilian leadership was wiped out.
So the IRGC moved to consolidate wartime decision-making before the first bomb even dropped. That implies the Iranian state inherently understood that their civilian addressable leadership was a massive vulnerability.
They knew it was a weak point.
They anticipated that a crisis would force a reallocated franchise, and they prepared the military faction to absorb the shock.
Exactly. It is an institutional adaptation that essentially concedes the very mechanism the paper is describing.
So the franchise was violently reallocated. The military faction gained total control over the succession. But a massive question remains. Was this just an accidental byproduct of the fog of war?
Right. Was it intentional?
Yeah. Did Israel simply bomb a building because they suspected a military commander was hiding in the basement, and the disruption of the succession was just tragic collateral damage?
The Cleston House paper argues no. It argues this was an intentional, publicly avowed policy. And they anchor this claim on a very specific piece of primary evidence.
And this is where the evidentiary rigor of the paper really shines. I mean, they aren't relying on anonymous intelligence sources or rumors whispered in diplomatic corridors. They're looking at the attacker's own published time-stamped record. We need to dissect the March 8th document.
Yes, specifically, it is a post published by the official Israel Defense Forces Persian language account on the platform X, formerly Twitter. The handle is @IDF Farsi. The post goes live on March 8th, 2026 at 09:31 in the morning.
Which is right in the middle of the chaotic window when the assembly of experts is frantically trying to execute this succession.
Right in the thick of it.
Let's break this post down because the paper assigns a specific legal and strategic function to each of its 3 paragraphs. So what is the first paragraph doing?
According to the paper's translation from the original Persian, paragraph 1 reads, quote, "After the neutralization of the tyrant Khamenei, the terrorist regime of Iran is trying to rebuild itself and choose a new leader."
So function 1 is clear acknowledgement. They are stating on the record that they are fully aware of the ongoing constitutional choosing process. They know exactly what is happening in the wake of the decapitation strike.
Paragraph 2 shifts from observation to declaration. It reads, quote, "Iran's assembly of experts, which has not convened for decades, will soon gather in the city of Qom. We want to tell you that the hand of the State of Israel will continue to pursue every successor and anyone who seeks to appoint a successor."
Anyone who seeks to appoint a successor, that's breathtaking in its scope.
It really is.
Function 2 is a standing policy declaration. It's not a recap of a past strike. It is an announcement of future military conduct.
Now, the paper does note a slight factual imprecision in the tweet. The Assembly does actually convene regularly for general sessions. It just hadn't elected a leader for decades, since 1989.
Right. Minor detail. But the operational intent is totally unambiguous. Which brings us to the third paragraph.
Yes.
This is the paragraph that elevates the document from a policy statement to a smoking gun. Quote, "We warn all those who intend to participate in the session to select the successor. We will not hesitate to place you two in our targets. This is a warning." End quote.
So function 3 is an explicit, naked threat of lethal violence directed at prospective participants in a civilian constitutional ballot, identified solely by their electoral function and broadcast in their native language.
But okay, if they had this explicit policy to terrorize the electors, why publish it on Twitter? Why not just bomb them quietly?
Right. Why leave a trail?
The Cleston House paper points out that it's not just that they published this threat, it's where they published it and, more importantly, where they hid it.
The paper introduces a concept called disclosure asymmetry, or the three channels. The authors observe that the attacking state broadcast its coercive intent on one specific channel while painstakingly keeping it absent from others.
So what does this all mean? Let's trace these three channels. Channel 1 is the English language IDF official war site, the global public-facing documentation of the campaign. What does it say about the succession in Qom?
Absolutely nothing. Zero. It details the military operations in exhaustive length. It covers the killing of Khamenei, the destruction of proxy networks, the targeting of missile silos. But there is no reference to the assembly of experts, the succession process, or the strikes in Qom.
In fact, the paper highlights a glaring irony on that English site.
Oh, this is fascinating. The same English language site hosts a detailed biographical article about Ali Khamenei. And that historical article narrates, without any disapproval or claims of illegitimacy, the 1989 assembly session that originally elected him.
Wow.
Yeah, it calmly discusses the deliberations and the uncoerced vote of the civilian clerics.
So the institution whose 1989 ballot they treat as legitimate historical fact on their English site is the exact same institution whose 2026 ballot they're threatening to bomb into oblivion on their Persian site.
Precisely. Now, let's look at Channel 2. This is the United States' formal legal defense of the military campaign. On April 21st, the U.S. State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor posts a document titled Operation Epic Fury and International Law.
And this is the legal justification provided to the United Nations and the international community. So what is their stated objective?
The State Department document lists 4 explicit material military objectives: the destruction of Iran's offensive missiles, the dismantling of missile production facilities, the degradation of the Navy, and ensuring Iran never possesses a nuclear weapon.
Disruption of the constitutional succession.
Completely absent, not a single word.
Which brings us to Channel 3, the @IDF Farsi account. The only place the threat to the constitutional procedure exists is in the target's language, directed specifically at the Iranian public and the electors themselves.
The paper also notes corroborating evidence here. The Mossad's Persian language account issued a similar threat right before the Qom strike, stating, quote, "No matter who is chosen today, his fate is sealed." 2 separate arms of the same state threatening the succession exclusively in Persian.
So why this elaborate shell game? If they had a policy to stop the succession, and they were willing to use fighter jets to enforce it, why hide it from the English paperwork? What were the lawyers afraid of?
Well, the Cleston House paper treats this asymmetry as an auditable trail of legal consciousness. They infer that the attacking coalition knew that targeting a constitutional succession procedure could not be defended in any international legal forum.
The State Department memo was published purely for the archives, to exist on the record so they could say they filed the paperwork.
Exactly. The paper explicitly notes that the U.S. legal memo was quietly posted to a website, not actively distributed to the press or heavily promoted. It was a legal defense published to exist rather than to be interrogated. Meanwhile, the actual operative coercive threat was broadcast only in the operational theater, where the people dying would see it, but the diplomats in Geneva or New York wouldn't be forced to confront it.
This naturally pulls us into the most profound and frankly disturbing argument in the entire Cleston House paper. It's not just that the attackers thought hitting the succession might be illegal, it's that international law actually doesn't possess the vocabulary to properly classify what they did.
This is where it gets really dense, but it's crucial. To understand this, we have to look at the deep philosophical architecture of international humanitarian law, or IHL.
The body of law that governs armed conflict.
Right, and its architecture is built on a very strict binary foundation. When a military commander or a military lawyer looks at a battlefield, the law tells them that the entire world is divided into exactly 2 categories: persons and objects.
Persons and objects, that's it. There's no third category for institutions or democracy or constitutional mechanisms.
That is the entire framework for targeting. If it's not a person, it's an object.
Okay, let's unpack how those 2 categories actually work in practice.
Under IHL, persons can be targeted based on their status. For example, if they are a uniformed soldier in the armed forces, or they can be targeted based on their conduct. If a civilian picks up a rifle and directly participates in hostilities, they lose their civilian protection and become a lawful target for the duration of that participation.
Okay, that makes sense. Soldier equals target. Civilian shooting a gun equals target. What about objects?
Objects are governed by Article 52, Paragraph 2 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions.
let me stop you there, because quoting protocol numbers can totally glaze over a listener's eyes. What was additional protocol I actually designed to achieve when it was originally drafted?
Good point. It was adopted in 1977, essentially to update the Geneva Conventions after the horrors of World War II and subsequent conflicts. The drafters wanted to strictly limit the devastation of war by protecting the civilian population and civilian infrastructure. They wanted to ensure you couldn't just carpet bomb a city, so they defined a military objective.
And how did they define an object that you were allowed to blow up?
The rule states that an object, a building, a bridge, a radar dish, a factory, can be lawfully targeted only if its nature, location, purpose, or use makes an effective contribution to military action, and if its total or partial destruction offers a definite military advantage.
Okay, so persons and objects. If you're a military lawyer evaluating the airstrike on the Assembly of Experts in Qum, where does electing a supreme leader fit into that binary?
It doesn't, and that is the blind spot. The law has no category for a procedure.
Why is a procedure so hard for the law to grasp?
Because the entire philosophical history of the Geneva Conventions was built to regulate physical, tangible entities that can be destroyed.
Right.
A person is a singular, located entity of flesh and blood. A building is a singular, located entity of concrete and steel. You can point a weapon at them, pull a trigger, and evaluate the physical damage. But a procedure is not an entity.
What is it then?
A procedure is a relation. It is a function that is distributed across many people, across a span of time, and across a sequence of acts. The power of the Assembly of Experts doesn't exist in the physical bodies of the 88 men, nor does it exist in the bricks of the building in Qum. It exists in the coordination and the legal relationship among the electors.
This feels like having a highly advanced antivirus software on your computer. The software is meticulously programmed to scan for two things: malicious files, which are the objects, and unauthorized users, which are the persons.
That's a really great way to visualize it.
But then a sophisticated hacker attacks your system.
Yeah.
They don't introduce a new file, and they don't create a fake user. They manipulate a fundamental network protocol that changes how the existing files and the existing users talk to each other.
Exactly.
The antivirus software is completely blind to it. It scans the file, says looks fine. It scans the user, says looks fine. The architecture just isn't built to perceive the relationship between them.
And that is exactly what happened in Qum. You can bomb the room where the electors meet. You can even assassinate an individual elector, but you cannot destroy the relation. You can only disrupt it, coerce it, or reweight the franchise. The categories of IHL only hold physical entities. The target here was an abstract, procedural relation.
Wait, I'm stuck here. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second, because I can hear military lawyers shouting at their speakers right now. If I bomb a building filled with people voting, I've bombed an object and I've killed people. Both of those are covered by IHL. Why does international law care if I don't have a specific word for the procedure occurring inside? Dead is dead. Destruction is destruction. The law covers the physical acts.
That is the exact counter-argument the military lawyers make. They argue there is no blind spot and that hitting this assembly was perfectly lawful under the existing rules. They try to wedge the attack on the procedure into the existing categories of persons and objects. And the Cleston House paper methodically walks through 4 of these common legal justifications and dismantles them.
Okay, let's test them. Argument 1. The military lawyer says, the Assembly of Experts appoints the supreme leader. The supreme leader is the commander-in-chief of the Iranian armed forces. Therefore, because they constitute the highest military command, the assembly itself is a lawful military target.
Right.
Now, that sounds somewhat plausible at first glance. If you hire the top general, you're part of the war machine.
The paper argues this logic proves way too much, and no state on earth would actually accept it. If you accept that appointing a military commander makes you a military target, then every United States senator who votes to confirm a 4-star general loses their civilian immunity and becomes a lawful target for an airstrike.
Oh, wow. Or the Electoral College.
Yeah.
They choose the U.S. president, who is the commander-in-chief. If a foreign adversary bombed the Electoral College while they were casting their votes, no American lawyer would shrug and say, well, they were appointing the commander-in-chief, fair game.
Exactly. It would be an outrage. And the Cleston House paper adds a brilliant ironic twist regarding Iran's specific constitution here. Under Article 111, the Assembly of Experts is the only body empowered to dismiss the supreme leader.
Wait, So,
Yes. So, if the attacker's goal was to remove a hostile commander-in-chief, the institution they attacked was literally the only legal mechanism in the Iranian state capable of doing so without violence.
that's wild. Okay, argument 2. The lawyer pivots, fine. The people aren't targets.
Yeah.
But the venue is an object. The building in Qom facilitated the appointment of the enemy commander, therefore it made an effective contribution to military action, so we legally bombed the object.
The rebuttal here focuses on the nature of the target versus the nature of the object. Analyzing the venue completely misses what was actually under attack.
Because it's not about the building.
Exactly. Destroying the room doesn't destroy the process, it just forces the process to migrate. The object is destroyed, but the true target, the constitutional procedure, survives and moves to remote, secure convening. The attacker hasn't actually neutralized a military threat. They've simply initiated the reallocated franchise. They've forced the succession into the hands of the military faction.
Argument 3. The electors forfeit their civilian protection by participating in the vote. Voting for the commander-in-chief constitutes direct participation in hostilities.
This relies on a very specific legal standard in IHL. To lose civilian immunity through direct participation, the accepted legal test requires a direct causal link between the specific act and actual harm to a party to the conflict. Firing a weapon is direct participation. Driving an ammunition truck to the front lines is direct participation.
Casting a ballot?
No reading of that standard, not even the most aggressive interpretations by the United States or Israel, stretches to cover the act of voting. Electing is an administrative political act. It is not fighting. You cannot legally shoot someone for casting a ballot.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most robust counterargument. Argument 4. It's a wartime necessity. The enemy's supreme command has been decapitated. The state is in chaos. Reconstituting that command is an urgent military necessity for the enemy, and therefore anybody convened to restore that continuity temporarily acquires a military character until the gap is plugged.
Ah, the command continuity defense. Cleston defeats this by looking directly at the attacker's own stated timeline and subsequent actions.
How so?
Well, even if you grant the premise that preventing the appointment of a new commander is a temporary military necessity, the threat published on March 8th explicitly targeted every successor and anyone who seeks to appoint a successor.
So it wasn't limited to the immediate wartime gap. It was a perpetual liability.
And we know it outlived the gap because they executed the policy weeks and months later, long after a new leader was named, and command continuity was supposedly restored. A rationale of command continuity logically expires the moment command is reconstituted. This policy clearly did not expire.
So if all 4 of these counterarguments fail, and you cannot legally classify a procedure as a person or an object, what is the actual legal violation that occurred here? Did the Cleston House paper find that they broke the law, or did they find that the law is just broken?
What's fascinating here is they found a clear violation of existing law, but it hinges on what almost feels like a technicality.
Explain that.
The violation they identify is of Article 51, Paragraph 2 of Additional Protocol 1. This specific rule prohibits acts or threats of violence whose primary purpose is to spread terror among the civilian population.
The March 8th tweet.
Yes. The tweet is a published threat of violence directed at civilians, identified by their civil function, explicitly designed to terrorize them into not participating in a constitutional process. The legal violation was complete the exact second they hit publish on that Persian language account.
But, and this is the terrifying part of the paper's conclusion, if they hadn't tweeted it.
If the attacking state had carried out the exact same armed coercion, bombing the area around Qom, destroying the communications infrastructure, forcing the reallocated franchise, but had simply kept their mouths shut and not published a naked threat on social media.
It would have completely escaped legal classification.
Completely. The law catches the tweet. It does not catch the violent coercion of the constitutional procedure itself. The physical elements are classifiable. A building was bombed, civilians were killed, but the overarching strategic act of neutralizing a state's procedure for succession remains unnamed and unprosecutable under the laws of war. As the paper states, that gap is not an acquittal, it is a finding.
And because the law cannot properly classify the attack on the procedure, the consequences of that attack don't just vanish once the election is over and the new supreme leader is announced. The coercive environment bleeds into the actual day-to-day governance of the state.
Which brings us to the timeline from March to July 2026, the period where we see the reallocated franchise transition from a mechanism of election to a permanent operating condition.
Let's trace this timeline because this is where the theoretical framework becomes bloody reality. March 9th, Mojtaba Khamenei is announced as supreme leader. The selection is technically over, but the environment is not. What happens on March 22nd?
Ali Larijani is killed in a strike.
And who was he in this context?
The IDF publicly announces him as the de facto leader of Iran following Ali Khamenei's death. So 13 days after a constitutional successor has been declared by the Assembly, the announced policy from March 8th to pursue every successor is executed against the first prominent figure who appears to fit the description or act in a leadership capacity.
So the threat wasn't a bluff, and it didn't end when the ballot box closed. Then we moved to April 21st. The U.S. State Department posts that legal defense we analyzed earlier.
Right. And in that document, they entrench what the Cleston House paper calls the ongoing conflict doctrine. They frame Operation Epic Fury not as a discrete intervention, but as just the latest round in a decades-long international armed conflict with Iran.
Why does that legal framing matter?
Because under an ongoing conflict frame, the legal requirements of necessity and proportionality do not need to be reassessed from scratch before every single subsequent military action. It provides a legal architecture with no expiry date for continued strikes. It essentially writes a blank check for persistent coercion.
So it's basically a permanent state of war.
Rare.
Fast forward to July. Early July, Israel's defense minister makes a highly public statement.
Yes. He publicly declares that the sitting, newly elected supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, is marked for death.
And then, on July 7th and 8th, while the state funeral for the assassinated Ali Khamenei is finally taking place, an event drawing immense crowds in Tehran, Qom, and Mashhad.
The largest kinetic military strikes since April suddenly resumed. This happens despite the fact that a 60-day memorandum of understanding was formally in force at the time between various parties.
The paper notes that the explicit motives for these specific July strikes are contested. Some analysts claim it was retaliation for proxy attacks. Others say it was related to naval movements in the Strait of Hormuz.
But Cleston House argues the specific motive for the July strikes doesn't alter their core finding. The fact that the defense minister publicly renewed the lethal threat against the head of state, combined with the immediate resumption of massive airstrikes, proves that the coercive environment surrounding the leadership never ended. The procedure was coerced, and now the governance is coerced.
Here's where it gets really interesting. What is the staggering, tangible result of this sustained coercion on the Iranian state?
As of July 18, 2026, which is the cutoff date for the Cleston House research paper, the newly elected supreme leader of Iran has not made a single public appearance in the 4.5 months since he was selected.
He didn't even attend his own father's state funeral.
No, his 3 brothers attended the funeral. He did not.
This is what the paper refers to as governing in absentia.
Exactly. If we connect this back to the core concept of the reallocated franchise, the 3 physical preconditions needed to hold a deliberative election assembly, time, and communicative security are the exact same physical dependencies required to govern a country.
Because to be a leader, you have to be able to be seen. You have to hold meetings, issue directives, receive intelligence briefings, communicate with your subordinates.
An office of state is exercised through physical appearance, through convening councils, through public address. If a military environment violently restricts who can safely gather to choose a leader, that same environment will violently restrict how the chosen leader can subsequently govern.
So the reallocated franchise isn't just a distortion of an electoral result. It becomes the permanent operating condition of the government itself.
The leader is functionally isolated. The paper quotes reporting from Reuters and various Iranian officials acknowledging that day-to-day strategic decisions are being made on the spot by decentralized security committees simply because they physically cannot reach the supreme leader for timely consultation.
So they're just making the calls themselves.
Yeah, he has been reduced to a symbol, retroactively legitimizing decisions that were reached by institutional consensus among the military faction.
The tragic irony of this is profound. I mean, the office of the supreme leader of Iran functioned for 37 years, primarily through immense public visibility. Friday sermons broadcast to millions, televised audiences with delegates, students, military personnel.
It was an office built entirely on addressability and public presence.
And now it has been forced entirely into the shadows. The physical reality of the Iranian state, the way power actually moves, deliberates, and operates, has been completely reshaped by foreign military force. And yet, not a single word of the Iranian constitution was altered.
Force didn't rewrite the law, it just changed the physical conditions under which the law could be executed.
Now, the paper's very careful to offer a major caveat here regarding the what-if of the situation, right? They don't claim to know who would have won a peaceful election.
Yes, that's important. They explicitly state that we cannot know if a peaceful, uncoerced assembly would have chosen a different leader. They point back to the 1989 succession of Ali Khamenei to illustrate how malleable the process is, even in peacetime.
What happened in 1989?
Well, in 1989, the assembly elevated Ali Khamenei, who was only a mid-ranking cleric at the time. His religious qualifications were largely manufactured and retrofitted to satisfy the political need for a successor who could manage the state apparatus after Khomeini's death.
So even in peacetime, the constitutional process is highly political, manipulated, and heavily influenced by factional power dynamics.
Exactly. The Cleston House paper makes no naive claim that a pure democratic process was stolen by the airstrikes. But they argue that the mechanism of coercion is the crucial finding. The armed coercion guaranteed that the only type of candidate who could possibly emerge and survive was one heavily protected by and completely beholden to the military faction that possessed the secure communications infrastructure to operate under fire.
As the paper states, the mechanism is the claim. The counterfactual is not.
Precisely. They aren't predicting an alternate history, they're documenting a structural reality.
So as we move toward the end of this deep dive, we have to ask the critical question. Where does this leave the rest of the world? Why should a listener in North America or Europe or Asia care about the esoteric legalities of the Iranian succession process and the blind spots of international humanitarian law?
Because a targeting template now exists. And it is a template that exploits a structural vulnerability shared by almost every constitutional government on Earth.
Most constitutional orders around the world route their sovereign power through a physical, deliberative moment. A parliament gathering to vote on a prime minister, an electoral college convening to certify a president, a conclave of cardinals locked in a chapel choosing a pope.
And the precedent has now been irrevocably set that these crucial, fragile, deliberative moments can be violently coerced, disrupted, and reweighted by a foreign military without triggering any clear, named violation of international targeting categories.
The law absorbs the attack on the building. It categorizes the killing of the officials. But it is completely blind to the attack on the constitutional procedure itself.
Which is why Cleston House issues a very specific, urgent recommendation at the end of their paper. They argue that international humanitarian law must be updated to explicitly recognize the armed coercion of a constitutional selection procedure as a distinct, named wrong.
They want a new legal category to protect the procedural function itself, separate from the physical building or the physical people.
Yes, because if the next attacker is smarter, if they use force to reallocate a nation's franchise, but are quiet enough not to publish a blatant threat on social media, the current legal framework will find absolutely nothing wrong with it. The coercion will be entirely invisible to the law.
And the paper also recommends a tool for domestic oversight, right? A way for citizens to monitor their own governments.
Yes, they call it the three-channel method. They recommend that oversight bodies, congressional committees, and journalists should constantly audit their own government's military actions by laying their pristine English-language legal defenses right next to the operational target language communications broadcast in the actual war zone.
Because the gap between those two channels tells you exactly what your government is willing to do, but knows it cannot legally defend in front of the world.
It is an auditable trail of legal boundary pushing and deliberate obfuscation.
This has been an incredibly dense, fascinating journey. We opened this deep dive by talking about constitutional law and international humanitarian law. We tend to view these legal frameworks like an X-ray, clear, binary, diagnostic. The bone is broken, or it is not broken. The target is a person, or it is an object.
But we've seen that modern warfare can shatter the bone without ever touching the skin, simply by altering the gravity in the room.
Think about the era we are entering. We aren't just talking about F-35s dropping bombs on assembly buildings anymore. We are talking about cyber warfare that can silently, instantly disable a nation's communications infrastructure on Election Day, paralyzing the civilian populace while the military retains secure comms. We are talking about autonomous drone swarms that can enforce a curfew and prevent physical assembly without a single human soldier ever crossing the border.
The future of conflict relies heavily on non-kinetic coercion, manipulating the environment rather than destroying the entity.
If modern warfare can reallocate a nation's franchise, dictate its leadership, and force its sovereign power into the shadows without technically breaking the laws of targeting, Does a constitution even matter if you don't have the physical security to enact it?
That is the chilling question the Cleston House paper leaves us with. The law assumes a world of stable, physical entities, but warfare has already moved into the realm of manipulating abstract relations.
You can write the most perfect, equitable, democratic constitution in the world with every check and balance meticulously crafted. But if the electorate is exposed to coercion, the franchise can always be reallocated to the snowplows. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, something to mull over until next time.